Are you guys okay in the back in terms of lecture? Like, has that been going okay in terms of volume levels and distraction and stuff like that? Okay. Yeah. Sweet. I'm gonna start in like less than a minute. Testing audio, Victoria. Just let me know if you can hear me. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. It's 10 o'clock. I'm almost awake. How about you guys? Yeah. All right. We're going to do this. Welcome to Wednesday, as it's notably called Hump Day. Just over the hump, right? Hopefully people are feeling good about how things have been going so far. Hello, Victoria. It looks like you guys are all ready to go and can hear me okay. So hopefully that's going to go well. I have a favor to ask, actually, on that note. Can anybody in the audience help me? Oh, nice. You're going to help me with the Slack stuff? Awesome. It's on the student Slack, of course, which is what you're on, web-ft-vic instead of van. -ft-vic for Victoria, -16 sep, and then you'll be able to autocomplete it from there, I think, right? Oh, it doesn't autocomplete for you? Yeah, exactly. So there's a 2019 that you can join there. Anybody else? So it's nice to have some redundancy there. Yeah? Awesome. Thank you so much. What are your names? Anne? Anne and Anthony. This is so good. I'm actually going to be able to remember these names. Oh, now I'm going to be held accountable to remember these names. So yeah, that's another thing I wanted to say is I suck with names. I have terrible memory. So it'll take me some time, probably a few weeks, if not longer, to get to know some of your names, right? Depending on our level of interaction. I think I've mentored a few of you already yesterday or day before, but I don't get scheduled that often, and I only lecture once a week, and that is shared across different cohorts. So I don't even see you in lecture every week. So this is an honor for me. My name is KV. I forgot to say that out, or Kuram Virani is my full name. As I had mentioned on day one for intros, at least for Vancouver, but for Victoria, you didn't get a chance to get introed by me, I don't think. I'm one of the co-founders, and I'm a software developer by trade, who's essentially fallen into education and entrepreneurship, right? So definitely, if you want to learn about software, JavaScript, Ruby, things like that, web development generally, I'd love to, or education, pedagogy, stuff like that, as well as open source software. I have a lot of interest there. I don't do enough on that front, but I'd like to do more in that realm. So those are my interest areas. Today's lecture is going to be a little bit of a review from what the stuff we've done so far, as well as going into objects. Something that truthfully isn't covered a lot in the prep course. Do we feel that way? Like there's not a lot of stuff with objects in the prep course compared to things like arrays and other primitive types, right? So this is like today is kind of the inflection point you'll find, where things are going to start to get more interesting, more challenging. And yeah, it's going to keep building on in that front. But before we actually get into the technical stuff, I do want to do some expectation setting. My agenda's up here, so I'll read that out first. We're going to do a little bit of a joke, because I'm told that you should start every public talk with a joke. So I've done it for 6 years now. So that's a tradition I'm going to maintain when I can. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I lecture, so that you get the maximum value out of it and my opinions on that stuff. Then we're going to get into something that nobody talks about enough, I find, and isn't even really a core part of our curriculum. Maybe it should be, but I think it's best talked about in lecture, which is like how to read code and why that's important. We talk a lot about writing code and crafting code, but we don't talk enough about consuming and reading code. It happens through osmosis, so I guess that's why we don't talk about it directly. It's going to happen. You're going to get good at it. But let's be more deliberate about it. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. We'll talk about a little bit of review on like primitive types and variables and things like that. But I, of course, won't spend too much time on it because you've spent some time on it already. And then we'll really dig into objects, right? I don't tend to just provide a topic like a solution. I'd like to kind of build to the problem and then say, okay, here's a solution to the problem, so that we actually understand their value proposition. So that's the journey I'm going to take for this lecture. And we'll have a little bit of an exercise that we'll do probably for about 20 minutes near the end, where we'll actually solve a larger problem using objects, right? Most of my lecture style, I should say, is going to be in the editor. I don't use a lot of slides generally. Some of our lecturers do, so you get a nice variety. But I tend to use more of the editor and maybe some visuals, drawing stuff and things like that, and talking, right? And my lecture style is not talking at you. I try to avoid that. I know I've been doing it so far, but I try to avoid that by multiple techniques. I try to add deliberate pauses in lecture, where I'll cause what I call an awkward pause. I won't even say why I'm causing the awkward pause. Maybe I need time to think. But usually you need time to think, right? You need time to digest what I just said, and maybe even ask some questions. So maximize those things, and feel free to raise your hand or blurt out a question. And for Victoria, I've got 2 volunteers here to help me monitor Slack, but I'll also be doing Command Tab quite a bit. Hopefully that doesn't jar people too much. I won't do it that much, but so I'll also be keeping an eye, but I tend to not be as fast as students who are proxying the questions for me. So I really appreciate that. And Victoria, I encourage you not to just ask questions, but also provide answers, because I tend to ask questions. So that's another thing that I do, is I'll ask you a question, and hopefully this cohort will be really excited about answering questions, right? In terms of, here's what I think. And it's okay to be wrong, right? It's okay to take guesses. What else? I try to do kind of more interactive lectures, where it's us solving problems together as opposed to me solving the problem and you watching, right? There's obviously a little bit of each, but try to mix it up. In terms of lectures in general, I don't think they're very good at imparting new knowledge. So I always get nervous, and we've tweaked things over the last 6 years since we existed. But we still tend to fall into the trap of okay, it's the morning lecture, so we'll talk about the topic that you'll cover today. And so of course we'll talk about objects today, and then you'll continue on to work with objects. But you'll notice that my lecture agenda is 50-50, right? It's a bit of stuff building up to objects and then objects. So there's stuff that may be listed in Compass under the lecture notes that you see when you click into the lecture that actually doesn't get covered in my lecture or other instructors' lecture. And I don't want you to panic or worry that you're missing out on some opportunity there in terms of learning, because truthfully, the majority of learning happens after lecture, right? So what the heck is the point of the lecture? Why are we spending or seemingly wasting these 2 hours of your day? Any kind of takers on that? What value do you find from your previous educational experience, or from what you've seen so far here? What value do you get out of lectures, out of curiosity? Or do you disagree? And it's okay to disagree and say, actually, I think I get the most knowledge out of lectures versus readings or whatever. I mean, everybody's different, right? Yep. First conversation of the day.
Yeah. I think it's cool seeing how a mentor goes through a problem and seeing how they write style-wise, and then asking questions about how their style compares to yours, and how you were writing the problem yesterday, perhaps, if you were reading stuff yesterday.
Right. So to paraphrase your answer, it's I'm going to use one word. I guess what word would you use to paraphrase that answer? I would use the word approach. Is that fair? Yeah. You're kind of looking at the developer approach of somebody who's done this for a few years and seeing how they tackle the problem, because we all agree here and we all know that there's not one right approach to solving problems in general in life, and definitely in software, right? So you kind of maximize value of how does somebody approach and think about problems. And do you just get that value from the instructor, or maybe even your classmates, hopefully?
Oh, definitely classmates.
Yeah, classmates as well, absolutely. What else? What else do you find is valuable from lectures? Yes, Anthony.
Just hearing the words that we're going to be sort of using later on. So when you use objects and keys and values, and you say it, it starts to sink in more than just glossing over it or perusing it for 15 minutes.
Yep. Anthony said, basically keywords that I can kind of relate back to when I'm continuing my learning journey. I would actually even take that further and say, maybe lectures help you emphasize what's important for the day, right? They kind of help set up your learning, but not so much giving you all the knowledge that you're going to get that day, but just set you up for success for that day a little bit, right? In terms of, here's the stuff to pay attention to. Here's what's important for you to really understand right now. Yeah, in the back. And is anything from Victoria? Nothing yet. Did you raise your hand there? No? Let's pretend you did. Do you have anything to say? No? Nothing to say for yourself? Nothing? All right. Yep.
I think like just with learning, like it's easy to get into that trap of like starting to doubt yourself and like question why am I here and that sort of stuff. But to see like a mentor do a lecture and see like their it's kind of an easygoing approach to going through a block of code, it just like provides you with that like reassurance that like get into that growth mindset.
Yes.
And it's like it's not actually that hard once you're there.
Yeah, what's your name? Jackson's got a really good answer that I was going to pitch out as well if nobody else did, which is, to paraphrase his answer, it's actually, I would use a word, maybe something like inspiration, confidence building, those kind of things, through demonstration, right? Through seeing them tackle code with ease, but also actually make mistakes and not have answers. So I actually make a deliberate attempt in front of students to not do what a lot of teachers tend to do, at least in my experience, which is to show overconfidence or try to hide their lack of knowledge on certain topics. I actually, even when I'm not sometimes I'm not confronted with the need to show you that I don't know something, but I'll deliberately show you that I don't know something. And then if time permitting, I'll actually show you how I go about answering that. Because I want you to appreciate that we don't know that much, as much as you think, right? It's easy to put people on pedestals, and especially in the first week where you're like, oh, I bet you most of you, and maybe many of you in Victoria as well, look at mentors and instructors and go, my God, it's going to take me years to get there. I don't even know if I can get there. Right? I don't even know what I don't know, right? And this is quite intimidating, right? Didn't expect a lot of laugh there, but I guess. There's my joke. Yeah, I don't even know what I don't know, and how do I even get there? And I bet you one of the things I do near the end of boot camp, when I get a lecture with you at the tail end, is I ask you again to reassess how you feel about instructors and how close you are to reaching that level of mentors and instructors. And actually the difference is you're like, whoa, I actually feel like I know how to get there now. And I'm already closer. And that's pretty cool, right? So a big part of that is also that dialogue and that confidence building, that inspiration, right? That's why it's important to keep students entertained. Oh, on that note, it's okay to zone out during lecture. It's my bad if you do. It's not your bad. I mean, it's obviously a mixed bad if you do. But I don't get upset and I don't take it personally. So if I see, I'll use that as body language to adjust my lecture style. So feel free to if you zone out and I'm like, hey, what do you think? What's your name? Adam. I'm like, hey, Adam, what do you think? I might point to Adam because he hasn't raised his hand yet. And Adam's like, sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Could you re-ask the question? Totally okay, right? We're doing a 2-hour conversation here. It's hard to pay attention for 10 minutes, I find at least, to somebody talking, right? And so let's just open that, talk about that elephant in the room and just say it's okay. And we're not going to judge each other for that. And I'm not going to judge you for it if that happens, Adam, or anybody, okay? If that's cool. And I didn't point at you because I didn't think you were paying attention, just, as an example. So there's that as well. Oh, and I tend to talk really fast. You might have noticed I tend to get excited, talk really fast. This is a fault of mine, one of many. So feel free to slow me down with questions or just say, hey, can you slow down or repeat that again? I tend to do that when I get excited, which is, of course, when I'm talking about code, right? So here we are. Oh, and the joke. I try to make the joke relevant. In this case, we'll go with my general programming joke, since we're not getting into deep topics yet. How many software developers does it take to screw on a light bulb? None. It's a hardware problem. Just blame it on the hardware, folks. Okay, so having talked about that stuff and nothing yet from Victoria in terms of emojis or memes or anything, so that's, I guess, a good sign. Let's talk about reading code. What happens often is code will be put on a screen, whether it's your screen or somebody else's. So you'll load up some code that you've inherited. It may be code that you wrote a long time ago, so you don't recognize it anymore. Or it may be code that somebody else has written. And in many cases, actually, code is brought up on a screen that you don't have control over, right? And then people are talking about that code. Examples of where that happens. Where does it happen that code is brought up on a screen and you don't even have control over that screen and somebody's talking about that code? You can probably think of an example right now. Yeah, lectures. Lectures are a great example, but what about the real world? Where else could that happen in your imagination? Where do you imagine that also happening once you enter your career? Conferences is a great answer. Name? John says conferences. Pair programming is another great example, which we'll be taking a little bit of a stab at next week. So you'll have a little bit of that as well. Although that'll be mostly you're working on new code, but yes, it could happen in pair programming quite a bit as well. So conferences, pair programming, any other cases? Yep. Technical interviews, yes. People bring up code and ask you to debug it, right? And maybe on their screen, and maybe you have control or not, but it's a stressful setting, right? Any others? There's plenty of other examples. Helping coworkers, absolutely. That's a big one. You're going to start doing that sooner than you think. If you think you're not going to be helping coworkers in your first year of being a software developer, you're probably wrong. Within your first month or two, you may be jumping in to help a new hire or somebody at the same level as you, or even maybe a senior who needs a rubber duck, right? We have Larry the rubber duck as a mascot for a reason. You can actually Google rubber ducking if you haven't already. It's actually a thing where you act as a rubber duck for another programmer. I'll leave that for you to research. So it could be rubber ducking as well, where you're looking at somebody else's code and helping them debug, essentially, right? Any other examples? Any other scenarios? Pull requests, yes. Yeah, that will be on your own screen usually, but you're looking at a pull request, which many of you probably don't know what that is, but essentially you're doing a code review, right? You're doing a code review on somebody else's change request for some piece of software. So not only are you creating these pull requests or these change requests, but you're also potentially reviewing them. Maybe you're one of many. And actually, with one of the companies I used to work at, and I think many do this still, is small teams, right? And if they're not remote, they'll actually sit around a TV like this on sofas, and they'll actually discuss the code, and the person who's made that pull request or that change will actually go through the code as well as the features, right, lecture style, and kind of present it and be like, this is the stuff I did, and people will actually ask them questions about the code. So you'll have to like digest information about what the heck they've written up there, and actually evaluate it and consume it, like understand what it's trying to do without reading every single line, right? So we want to be efficient when it comes to reading code. Oh yeah, that's another one from Caitlin. When you Google something and you're reading an article about coding and how to solve a problem, you sometimes get a wall of text, right? That wall of code. Being able to parse that quickly is a very valuable skill. So I guess let me ask you your strategies, and hopefully Victoria will jump in too, in terms of reading a large chunk of code text. So I use this. Some of you may recognize it. I saw a handful of you completed some of the stretch work from yesterday, and others who, were done for the core work for the day tended to work on today's stuff, which is also fine. I'm not judging on that front. It's both strategies are good. But anyway, this is stretch work from yesterday, and that's not why I'm bringing it up. I just figured that's a great example of something that's already written. I don't have to write it myself. And you're supposed to read it and try to understand what it's doing, and you're supposed to debug it, but we're not going to do that here. How would you go about reading code like this? What's your strategy? Yep, your name? Fabio, yep. Fabio says start with the entry point. So tell me where your eyes are landing then. Are they landing on line 1? Print in frame. So I guess I would find, I mean, in my case, my editor, what I do is I even highlight it so that it's nice to find. In this case, it's easy, but not always. And then, yeah. So I'll paraphrase for the recording and for Victoria as well, which is you basically look at the control flow, right? You said entry point, but yeah, I guess that's good too. But you follow the code in the same way that JavaScript runs the code. Is that true? Almost true, I think. You went straight down, and maybe it's because you're familiar with this exercise. But the truth is that you wouldn't know that that's where It's not always the case that it's like this, right? Where there's like the entry point at the bottom. So anyway, let me ask other questions. So other people, how else do you look at this? Break it down. So what do you mean by that?
Into the simplest bits of code.
You go on. So tell me in this. Yeah, absolutely. So give me an example of how you do that here.
Say like the longest and the border, so the border would be the start of the longest.
So you start reading these variable names and try to infer what they mean?
Yeah, exactly.
So you're actually applying a little bit of your human intuition here. A machine doesn't really care or use intuition to learn what it thinks the program is. It's just running it like code. It doesn't care what you call variables. But you may be applying your intuition and experience with code and just English are saying, well, I can kind of infer what these things mean based on their names. And you're applying even a better algorithm, I guess, than JavaScript would in trying to navigate code, right? So maybe you're doing a combo of what Fabio said and what you're saying, right? Where you're saying print and frame is likely, if it's named well, and based on what it's taking in, I can actually start making inferences and assumptions about what the code is doing. So that's also a good strategy. I like that. And you said breaking it down into smaller bits as well, of course. But I want to talk more about how you do that. Any others? So hand goes up here, but let me just check Victoria. Nope, nothing yet. Go ahead.
If I'm not sure what something's doing, I'll console log it. So if I look at this and I'm like, what is this? What is it doing? I'll just console log it.
Yes, absolutely. Great answer. It's not static, and sometimes we don't have that ability if it's in a meetup or a conference that we've gone to, or if it's, but if it's on a screen in a tutorial, we can still usually we're probably going to be using it, and then we can actually not just use it, but actually understand it. And this is a common mistake I see students doing, especially when they're in crunch mode with midterm projects or final projects, or just in life in general, where you bring something in that you found in a tutorial or an exercise or a Stack Overflow answer, but you don't realize that you now own that code, and you better be able to explain it in a code review or to your peers or whatever, to yourself, right? And so that exercise of putting in the console log and debug messages helps you really understand what's happening, right? What is this function returning? What are the properties of that thing that it's returning? Things like that. Right, absolutely. Any other strategies that people employ? Remember, there's no one right answer here. I'm going to give you my opinion, but it's also just one strategy, and it really depends on the situation. Yes?
In the context where we're just looking at code for the first time, is that the context?
Yeah, we're looking at new code for the first time as the context, or even code that we wrote a long time ago, right? And it's complex. It's not just a small 5-liner.
I guess usually I start oh, are there comments? If there are not comments, it's like, oh no, this is. If I wrote myself and there's no comments, and looking at it 4 months later, it's like, okay, this is going to be interesting.
Yeah.
Then I'll look at the blocks of code. If you have functions or objects that are obviously separate from there are separate entities. If I don't instantly remember or know what it is, I'll make a note of what it wants into it and what it's pumping out. So if I see it used later, I can say, oh, we're pushing something into it, and I know this is kind of what we want to get out of it. So if I look at these bit of code, I can skim through it.
Yeah. So to paraphrase that, you kind of look at blocks of code in terms of functions and loops, and basically where code is nested. Is that fair? Yeah, and different scopes. So mostly functions then. And you kind of use that to your advantage. And that actually speaks to a thing that's really important that you may not be doing that well, or you may wonder why it's so important, which is indentation. Right? I don't know if you've had a chance yet where you've asked for help and actually a mentor says, your indentation needs to be fixed. Let's fix that while we're debugging this. Otherwise, it may be the source of our problems or our source of our misunderstanding. JavaScript doesn't care that stuff is indented or not. You could literally write this entire app in one line of code without any spacing or indentation or new line characters, literally all in one line. It doesn't care, right? White space doesn't matter. So for us, this is why we're doing it, and it actually helps us quickly navigate code. So actually, I use indentation quite a bit to my advantage, right? Some editors give you functionality like being able to collapse functions and stuff, and some people use that. I find myself never using that, but maybe that's just, again, there's different preferences. But I use indentation quite a bit to just ignore. And to Fabio's point, what I do is I definitely follow the control flow as much as possible, right? But I can't just follow the control flow if I'm just looking at some code on someone's screen. Maybe I don't know where the control flow is actually coming from. I don't know where the entry point is. So then I'm actually doing Anne's strategy of reading the words, how variables are named, how functions are named. And guess what comes up time and time again in code reviews? how you name things, right? That helps you quickly digest what's happening. Calling things X or array or object or list, although you'll even see me do it sometimes in lecture, should be avoided, right? It's okay for maybe demonstration code. Even that's arguable. So you will find in code reviews, hopefully, mentors telling you about naming. Or you can ask them if they're not telling you, hey, like, I'm not stuck, but I asked for assistance here because I want a code review. What do you think about my naming? What do you think about my indentation? I know we're using a linter here, but like, what do you think about my code style in general in terms of how I approach this? So that's another thing I wanted to mention before we get into the thick of this, is to leverage your peers and your mentors, not just when you're stuck, but when you are done with something or when you are making progress with something, right? But yes, I definitely will look at a function name here and go print in frame, takes in a list. Okay, interesting. And then I'll move on from there into other ones. And I'll remember those function names, much like what JavaScript would do. JavaScript would read line 1, then it would read line 15, then it would read line 25. It would not run what's inside the function until the function is called. And we would be doing the same in many cases when we're trying to trace our program in terms of how it's working, especially when we're debugging, right? We forgot to mention, if we have control over the screen, we can also run the code, right? In many cases, not all cases, to actually get an understanding of what the whole kind of application is actually trying to do. And in the case of code reviews and presentations, if they're done well, they're showing you the end result and showing you the code. Otherwise, it becomes hard to visualize what the code is doing, right? In this case, this one is trying to print these words in a frame with asterisks and not doing a good job of it. And your job is to debug it, but we're not going to go there. If you're interested about stuff like this, definitely there's a lot of stretch work every week. You can prioritize it such that you do some stretch work for the day and then you move on to the next day to reduce risk. And then on Friday or on the weekend, you can do the stretch work that you have accumulated as debt. That's if you're feeling comfortable with the material. So don't let me stress you out by making an assumption that you'll get to stretch. Many students don't get to much of the stretch until they graduate, at which point they have a laundry list of things that they can go through to keep working on their coding skills, right? So keep that in mind too. How has this been so far? Have I been talking too fast? It's okay? Have I bored you guys to death? No? Okay, that's good. Hopefully this has been somewhat valuable. Yeah? I want to talk about primitive types next. So we'll do that in this file. Anything from Victoria? Do an awkward pause at this point before we get into this. Any questions or any thoughts about anything that I said so far? No? Primitive types. Can somebody tell me what they are? I know there's a reading about them today, but there was some talk about that in the prep course as well, so it's a bit of a review. What are primitive types? Yep.
There's 6 of them. There's Boolean, undefined, numbers, strings, and 2 more.
Sure. So your name?
Lizzie.
Lizzie's answer is, well, there's 6 of them, I think, and she started kind of listing them, which is good. We want to list them here, although that's not my biggest priority. What are they? Yeah.
They're the building blocks of programming.
Building blocks of programming. I mean, functions are also building blocks of programming. So I guess maybe with the word programming is too vague here, but I think you're on the right track. So do you want to, somebody else perhaps? Lots of participation, I love this. We'll go with you.
Are they like just all the things that aren't objects?
Things that aren't objects is not necessarily a bad answer, but I would like multiple angles on this. Yep, Fabio, right? Types that are built into the language. Any more attempts? Yeah, or not attempts, but angles. Yourself, Anne?
Simplest forms of data you can
Yeah, like simplest amount or type of data that you can represent or store. Yeah, and that's what I was kind of saying, the building blocks of programming, but specifically, software is made up of 2 major things, in my opinion, at an abstract level. One of them is data, information. And the other, anybody want to take a guess? Software is data and?
What you do with the data.
What you do with the data, exactly, behavior. It's your how you're handling the data. So it's behavior and state, in my opinion. I guess I'll write that here, even though it's not really a primitive type definition. Software is behavior and state, which is information. Right? So our variables are often storing this state, right? This information, whether it's a number or a string or things of that nature. And examples of primitive types include numbers, right? Strings. What else? Oh, Boolean for true, false. In JavaScript, there is null and there is undefined, which is a little confusing. Not all languages have two different kind of almost synonyms, right? The lack of something is null, the lack of something is undefined. Any others? Sorry?
Symbol.
Symbol, yeah, that one's we don't touch that too much, but yes, symbol is a thing as well. And there's one that we've missed, I think. Is there more? Yeah, exactly. Nan, nice, nice. It's okay, it's not a competition. I like you all the same. Nice. Yeah, Victoria's not a number, exactly. Nailed it. Thank you, Graham. Simplest form of data, indeed. Look at that. So I can store numbers like this, and then I'm able to console log them, right? And if I run this piece of code, whoops, not that code, this piece of code, I expect to see 5 on the screen, right? And so I do. Sorry, I'll just zoom in a little bit for people in the back. And so what happens if I take that and assign that to another variable? What do I expect the value of that variable to be? 5, exactly. So if I console log that, maybe I'll just say here's B, so I can kind of label my output. Console log can take as many arguments as you want. It'll just, print them out. Whoops. My command key is like not working very well. I took it to the Apple store. They're going to fix it for me. It's pretty cool. I've had this Mac for like 5 years, or like maybe 4 years. And you know how they had the keyboard issues with like the new keyboard style? I've just been dealing with it since day one. I've just been lazy. I took it in 3-4 years later, and they're like, yeah, we'll replace it all for you, including the battery and everything that's attached to it. So I'm going to get a new battery, which is pretty cool. I'll do that in the next few weeks. Anyway, until then, you have to deal with my typos. But yeah, B is 5 as well, which is pretty cool, right? What happens if I do this? What will the value of B? I guess let's do that after the output, and then let's do the output again. What do I expect to happen? I'm just going to add 1, and B will increment by 1, and therefore I will see the value change to 6. We know that the value of num beforehand is 5, so I'm not going to put it there. But what's the value of num now? There's 2 possible answers here. I heard somebody say still 5. How many people feel that it's still 5? It seems like not everybody's sure about that. How many people here feel that it's the other answer, which is 6? How many people feel like the original value has changed to 6? No hands go up. Okay. You're right. Stays as 5. So what does that tell us? What do we learn here? Or what is this a good review of? Variables, but assigning value to variables. When it comes to primitive types, what is JavaScript and many languages, what do they do? First of all, they execute top-down. Absolutely, that's pretty important in code. It shouldn't be randomly executing lines. But in terms of when I assigned B, and I assigned B to num, what did it take from num? Yep. It just took whatever was inside that variable, right? So if you want to picture the variable as a box, as a location in memory, it stored the number 5. It literally had the number 5 in binary in that memory location, in a memory address, as it's called, right? We're not able to access that memory address, we're not able to look at the address. We're not able to go like, what is the address of that piece of memory, which is another number in and of itself so that it can find it in memory. But we are able to look at what's inside that address, what's inside that mailbox or PO box or whatever you want to call it, right? And then when we assigned that to another location by declaring it as with let, we could have used const. Actually, we couldn't have. It would have thrown an error here, right? But if I assign num to b, it actually takes the value in there and puts it into this other. So now they have 2 5s essentially in memory, right? Which is interesting. Cool. You may already have known that, but I think it's a good review because it's going to kind of build towards what we need to talk about. Any questions about this before I move on? I threw out kind of a statement about const not working. Are we feeling comfortable with that if I made this const? Actually, my editor is right away causing an error because it integrates with ESLint. Yours might not, and you might only notice that when you run ESLint or when you run the Node app. But if I were to run it, it would tell me that b is trying to be reassigned. We're trying to set b equal to something. And no dice because you cannot reassign a const, right? So I get actually a stack trace with an error from that line that says assignment to constant variable. Right? And similarly, if I were to change the value of num, b would be unaffected because they're completely separate memory addresses, right? Let's talk about arrays next. We've spent some time with arrays, especially in weeks day 1 and day 2, like yesterday and day before. So hopefully you're feeling somewhat comfortable with arrays. Right? We're not masters of arrays. We don't use them for every single problem in the world yet. But we're hopefully a little bit more acquainted with arrays and primitive types and hopefully like if statements. But if you're not, if you're like, actually, I'm not comfortable with that stuff yet, don't worry. Just like with today, where the focus is on objects, what are you expecting to happen by the end of today? Are you expecting to like fully be comfortable with objects? Because if you are, most of you will be disappointed. Right? The way we teach things is a lot of these fundamentals in weeks 1 and 2, you will still be dealing with them and learning them. I can guarantee you, especially some of the week 2 stuff, you will still be like struggling with it come week 5, 6, 7. Right? And some of those concepts are just hard, so we introduce them early, so that you have enough weeks with them, enough time with them to be able to build on them. And objects is definitely one of those things. If you think objects is simple, especially in JavaScript, you're wrong. There's a lot of things about objects I don't fully understand yet in JavaScript. Right? But anyway, coming back to arrays, here's an array of size 3 with just 3 numbers in them. Right? Arrays can have any type of data in it. It's a collection. And it's an ordered collection, right? So in order to access an element at the second location, I can use a certain notation to do that, right? I can say array, again, terrible name. We'll just call it numbers, maybe. Numbers at 1 will not correspond to this one, but actually will correspond to the location, right? So it's corresponding to the second location, which would be the value 2. So we see 2 being output there. So far, so good. How do I modify the array? Quick review. Well, first of all, how do I get the, how do I know how big the array is? This one's an easy one because we've looped through arrays before. Length, yep. So there's the length, which should be 3. We see that. And then how do I increase that length? Maybe length plus 1? No. I can insert something into the array. There's many different ways. Do you want to does anybody want to take a stab at one? Push, yeah, exactly. Numbers.push. We can push a number in. And that allows us to kind of increase that array and add something to the tail end, right? As we've done a little bit with, I think we did that in low tide, I guess. Okay, but what happens when I do I expect digits to now look the same as numbers when I console log it, right? So it's almost like I'm console logging numbers. Actually, let me just, you can see that, right? Numbers and then digits, so two outputs that are identical, right? And I've already modified numbers here, and then I assign that to digits. And then let's say I mutate the array again, this time digits, by maybe doing push again. I guess I would expect digits I'll just maybe put that here so we know which thing we're actually looking at. So I console log digits again, and I expect it to have 500 in there as well? In the very last one. Yeah, because when this code runs, right, like as you said, it's linear from top down, so this hasn't run yet. Maybe in like quantum computing or something that's not true, I don't know, but like in traditional computing, you know, the other part hasn't run yet. And so we expect to see first digits with just the 400 in there, and then we expect to see digits with 500 in there. And what about numbers? Again, two possible answers. Numbers either stays the same, or numbers does not stay the same and is actually mutated as well as a result of digits being mutated. So which is it? What do you guys think? So stays the same? Changes? Oh, sorry, I can't tell who's saying it. It changes. Okay, so stays the same. Half the class. No, more than half. Majority of the class. Changes. Two people. And Victoria, I mean, I don't know who. Okay, so we got Alan Dodge. It's a great name. Also saying that numbers will change. So we've got two people saying numbers will change. That's it? How many other? So let's just, numbers will change. I didn't change numbers. I mean, I did early on with 400, but we're talking about the 500 change here. I specifically changed digits. Stays the same. Okay, let's see it. All right. What the hell just happened? Fabio was right. And so was Alan. What happened here? Yeah, it changed. We thought we knew arrays. The push modified, well, we thought we modified digits, but it looks like numbers has been modified too. Yes. Yeah. So what we have learned, you've kind of jumped a little bit ahead. What we've learned though, this is another great way to learn, by the way, not just through reading documentation, because honestly that can be boring at times. And has its place, of course. I do that a lot. But I also just experiment. I read documentation, I read a Stack Overflow, and then I open up Node REPL or Ruby's REPL or whatever language I'm trying to learn at the time, and I go ahead and try to experiment with that language to really try to understand what that answer is saying on Stack Overflow or whatever, right? And so that's essentially what we've done here. And what did we actually learn from this experiment? And maybe some of us haven't learned because you already seem to know that, Fabio, but like for the majority of us, what did we learn here? Yeah. Sweet. There's a comment on Slack. Numbers and digits point to the same instance of one array. Yes, that's what I would deduce too, because I did push once, and I affected what seemed like 2 arrays. So that tells me that it was actually the same array, right? So what does that tell me about actually when I created the variable digits and I assigned it numbers? How is that different than when I did that in the previous exercise? Yeah. Exactly. Digits now points to the address, the same address as numbers. So what I guess this is kind of harder to conceptualize, but when I actually create an array, a variable, and give it a value of another variable, okay, whatever's in that box, it literally is taking the value in that box, okay? In the case of an array, the value is not the array. The value is actually another memory address that points to the array. So it's something like, 5 million blah, blah, blah. Like we can't see it, but it actually is digits and numbers contain the same value. And that value is some gigantic number that points to another location in memory, which contains the array. So actually, what this tells me is that when I create an array, just that first line of code, and I'll get to the questions, this line of code, I've actually created 2 locations of data in memory. I've created numbers, which is just literally one value, which is a memory address. And then I've created a larger piece of memory to store the 3 numbers. And one points to the other. This is a little bit of an advanced concept. This is like more computer science-y. But it helps us kind of visualize and conceptualize. And I'm actually going to visualize this a little bit too, not on the whiteboard this time, but on the screen. But there were some questions here locally, and maybe some from Victoria before we move on. So questions locally or comments? Yeah.
So if why don't for each loops access elements by reference? If this is assigned reference.
So the question is, why don't for each loops access things by reference if these things are if these things are assigning by reference? So you mean like, for example, if I'm for eaching through an array? Yeah, that's a good question actually. So, and I mean, I'm not even going to use for each here. I'm going to show you what you're talking about, right? So if I do let n equal to digits. Digits was the first one, or numbers was the first one we created, right? So numbers, 0. So that's the first item in numbers. And I say, actually, I want to change n to be 8. OK? What happens here? Does the array get modified? Because I grabbed the first element there, and then I modified it by setting it to 8. So if I console log numbers now, is it going to be 8, 2, 3? Or is it going to be 1, 2, 3 still? 1, 2, 3, says Fabio. Yep.
I think this is different than a for each loop.
It's actually not. But we can, I don't think it is in the way that you're asking the question, but I could be wrong in terms of how you're asking the question. I don't want to do a for each yet because you'll be looking at for each in a little bit more detail tomorrow. So I'm debating in my head whether I want to go down that hole because I also want to. But let's go through this a little bit because it's also a good thing, and I think it speaks to what you're saying. But maybe we could talk about that a little bit later. I created a new variable, and I assigned it the value of numbers at 0. Okay, the value at numbers at 0 was 1. So it copies the number 1 into n. And then I change the value in n from 1 to 8. Nothing happens to the original array, as Fabio indicated. Okay? Because n doesn't point to numbers at 0. It is the value of numbers at 0. It was copied into n. Whatever we see as the first item gets copied into n as a primitive, essentially. Right? This is a little confusing still, and I don't know if I'm doing the best job in explaining it. But with primitives, the behavior seems a little bit different than arrays. But then if we dig deeper, we realize that it's actually not different when we visualize it. Yeah.
So basically, that relationship where we're pointing to not the value inside the variable, but the variable itself, that
Yeah, objects like arrays tend to not take up the entire, because they're so big, they don't fit in the variable. The variable just fits a number that points to it, right? So the number there is what you're copying, not the array. So you're actually copying what's called the pointer, often in computer science, the thing that's pointing to the array.
And you only have that pointer unless it's primitive type that you assign to that new variable.
Yeah, so when we actually say like let a equals 5, we're just storing literally the number 5 into that variable. Or the same with the Boolean, or not a number, undefined. Like those are actual values that we're putting right into the variable. Whereas when we put an array or an object in a variable, we're still putting a number in the variable, and then that number is the pointer to the array. And when we copy that variable, we're actually just copying the number, which means we're actually copying the pointer, not the actual array itself. We don't duplicate the array. There's still one array in memory as a result. I actually want to visualize this.
Target something inside of the array, then it's primitive.
Same rules apply when you go inside the array. If it's a number, we grab the number. What if there was an array inside of an array here? Right? What if this fourth item was an array? Now when I try to access this fourth element and give it to another variable, they're both pointing to the same array. And if I modify one, I'll modify the other. So the same rule applies as I go deeper and deeper into nesting arrays, for example. Okay, so anytime I'm dealing with an array or any kind of object, I'm not creating a copy of it, I'm creating a copy of its pointer, which is how we're actually accessing it.
And if you pointed to 3, for example, would that still apply? Like since it's not an array?
No, with 3, because that's actually a primitive value, I'm duplicating 3, and if I modify the duplicate, I'm not modifying the original. Whereas with the array, I'm modifying the original if I modify the array. So actually, let me visualize this so that it's a little bit easier. What we're going to use to visualize this, Travis, yesterday, I believe, introduced Python Tutor, or JavaScript Tutor, I should say. Yeah. So I'm going to run this on JavaScript Tutor so we get an idea of what's going on here, because this is blowing our minds a little bit, right? So here's JavaScript Tutor, which is pythontutor.com/javascript, right? It was originally just Python, but now they've added a whole bunch of languages. Cool, they have some kind of volunteer help thing, which is new, I think. Anyway, let's paste the code in here. And let's step through it. Let's visualize the execution. So it hasn't executed the first line yet. It's the arrow is on the first line. How many people have already used this? Everybody used this already? Only a few. So it's good, probably a good exercise to go through this. So I'm visualizing the execution. Don't use this as a crutch. Like, don't do this for every single assignment from now until the end of the program, or even like for the next week. Like, this is a good check, but ideally you should be doing this in your head. Okay, so until you're comfortable with that, you're using this as a way to learn to do that. And so we've got the output. The console logs will show up in here, and then I can hit forward. And remember what I said, that in the first line we actually create two things. We create the variable, which has a number, and that number is not shown, but it's shown as a pointer. And it points to the other place in memory where we've defined this object. So two things have actually been created in memory: the pointer and the values. Okay, and this is true for arrays and objects of other types. Next line is just to console log that, so that'll just appear here in the print output. And the next thing we're doing is we're modifying the array, so we expect to see 400 being added there. And then we expect that to get console logged, as we see here. So far, you guys with me? And then, this is the tricky one, right? Line 9, we create another variable, but we do not create another array. You don't see square brackets on this side. Square brackets is notation for creating an array. Okay? We are simply assigning the value of whatever's in numbers to digits. That means whatever's in this box here, okay? Which is an arrow, a pointer. And therefore, digits will contain the same numerical pointer to that same array. So when we console log digits now, we're still console logging that same array. And now when we modify what seems to be the second array, but really is the original, it modifies the one and only array that we actually have that both are pointing to. So it doesn't matter which one you mutate. You're actually mutating the data, and there's only one copy of it right now. Okay? Now, we get to this, which creates n. And again, there's no array on this side in terms of creating a new array. We're accessing an array. Okay? And we're saying, what is the value in number 0? So it looks at number 0 in order to deduce what number to put in here. And it goes, well, number's a pointer, so I guess I'm going to have to go here. Number's at 0. That's what that is. So it literally has the value 1 in that memory location. Okay? It's not another arrow. If it was another arrow, it would take and copy that arrow, just like we did earlier here, that pointer. But it literally is the number 1, and so it will add the number 1 inside that box. Okay? And therefore, modifying this value will have no bearing on modifying this value because they are completely different from each other. Question?
Rob, could you add like an array inside the array?
Yeah, that's my next step anyway. So great next step. So let's go ahead and after we modify it, it becomes 8. That's great. But now let's edit this code a little bit, and maybe I'll actually do it at the bottom here, where I'll say numbers at let's say 7 is equal to another array. And then we will notice, because numbers is the same as digits, right? They're the same array, which is this one. We'll see that at location 7, there will be an array inside of here. So let's just confirm that. Here we are. So now when we go through this, about to execute that line, that final line that I added, and we see that 5 and 6 were not defined, so it had to allocate them because it is a linear list. And we jump to 7, and 7 is now the array, right? Now, unfortunately, it's not visualizing it with an arrow, so that's a bit confusing. But if we were to say, let letters equals numbers 7. Okay, so now I have another variable called letters, which is pointing to that new array that I've created. The same rule applies, where if I modify letters, I'll be modifying numbers at 7. Okay, let's take a look at that as the next thing. Is this an okay exercise? Is this valuable? Yeah? We haven't even talked about objects yet, although we kind of have, but not fully yet. We'll take a break in a couple minutes as well, and then we'll talk about objects for the latter half of this lecture. Or at least objects directly. So anyway, let's go to where we were. We know that line 22 creates that array. And now the last line, line 24, is going to execute. And it will, let's see what it does. So this has clarified the visualization a little bit for us, because before I didn't feel the need to draw the arrow, but there was always that arrow, okay? And now it's like, shit, there's 2 things pointing to this, so I better draw those arrows, because it's confusing. And it says, yeah, letters is actually the same value that was at numbers 7, which was a memory address pointing to this new array that we had created. Yep, question?
So how do you make that not happen? Command to copy an array, like linking to the same array.
Yeah, so the question is, how do you make that not happen? How do you make it so that you make a copy? Because, I mean, we're not talking about problems right now, but let's pretend there's a problem where you need a copy of the array as opposed to a reference to it. Any suggestions? Oh, you haven't given me an answer yet. Go ahead. Yep, map could be used to create an array. Yep. But it's a bit overkill, I think. Oh, nice. Victoria. Slice? Yes. How would you use slice? Well, slice basically returns a new array, and it returns a new array based on some index, because you only care about stuff after that number. So it essentially gives you whatever's after that number. So you can just say 0 and be like, slice the whole thing and give me a new copy, please. Right? Normally, so that could be done as well. There's probably like 5 other, there's probably many other ways. Right? You could loop through an array yourself and create a new array empty, loop through this array, and push values one at a time to this new array. Caitlin's killing it. Yes. Exactly what I just said, Caitlin. Thank you. So there's many different ways. And, I wonder if there's like an official way in JavaScript. JavaScript copy array. Let's see. And when you see the word reference, it basically means pointer, right? I used both words synonymously. You heard me say reference, and you heard me say pointer. So because arrays in JavaScript are pointers or reference values, when you try to copy it using equals, it will only copy the pointer or the reference to the original array and not the value of the array, not the exact. It won't create a new array. To create a real copy of array, you need to copy over the value of the array under the new. This is very confusing in terms of how it reads. Thank you, Samantha Ming. Now, Samantha's showing some new syntax that we suggest you not look at right now. That's available. Yeah, that's right. Avert your eyes. This comes later in the program because it's a new way of doing things. So we'll pretend that didn't happen. But I do appreciate her use of emojis in code. But we can see slice actually is a very popular answer for creating a shallow copy. It's interesting, though. They say shallow copy. What does that mean? Can of worms. I'm going to leave it aside. And I let you Google and learn that and ask mentors or future instructors on that stuff. This is it gets very slippery, right? Especially when you're talking about copying objects. Oh my gosh, that's like a deep topic in JavaScript. It shouldn't be, but it is. OK. Thank you. Ooh, array.from. I don't think I know array.from. Array.from sounds even nicer. Ooh, this is probably the nicest way. Array.from is a built-in function in JavaScript which creates a new array instance from a given array. So it's essentially slice 0. In case of a string, every alphabet of the string is converted to an element. Oh, so you could even call this on a string, which is really cool. So you can do array.from string. And then it will give you that. So let's try that out. Let's say we came across this because a peer told us about it. What does this do? It gives me an array of letters for that whole string. But if I take an existing array, it will just look like it's not doing much. But if I put that in Python or JavaScript Tutor, I will see a difference. I will see that it actually creates a copy of the array. Here's 1, here's 2, right? It ran through the array and created a copy. Cool, great answers. Thank you so much from Victoria in terms of teaching me about array from. I told you I'd deliberately point out what I don't know because I want you to value what's important in being a developer. Okay, it's not about knowing the entire JavaScript surface area, I guess, like all the different functions in this particular language. It's really about your approach. That's why I think when I lecture, I focus a lot on approach and less on knowledge. Like, yes, I showed you I taught you something new potentially, but I really taught you how to actually go about experimenting and learning about that, hopefully, as well. So we'll take a break for about 10 minutes, and we'll re-adjourn it 14 after. And we'll spend 45 minutes talking about objects a little bit more. Cool? OK, thanks. Hey.
So I feel like it's cheating.
The for each thing?
Well, yeah, because I mean, it's just calling the array. number is just the function of the object.
Yeah,
itself,
exactly, right. So when we say at 1, we're actually grabbing whatever's in that memory address.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's obviously like you mentioned. You said Python like 4 times.
No, I actually am not
Don't.
comfortable with Python. Are you?
Yeah, I love Python.
Nice.
I was-
Python's awesome.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, are objects like the same as dictionaries, or are they just very similar?
Yeah, so in JavaScript, it's a bit confusing because in class-based object-oriented programming, objects are kind of first class. They're objects are not classes actually, but they're derived from classes, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, classes are objects in Ruby. I think in Python too. I think a class is also an object in Python. At least it is in Ruby.
Yeah. You made like a pre-defined object.
Just an object. Yeah, it's just like when you define a class, you're actually creating an object.
Fair enough.
It's just an object that has specific behavior, which is creating new objects like itself, essentially.
All I'm saying is that when you do a for each loop in JavaScript,
Yeah.
when you make like your callback function on the inside,
Yeah.
on the documentation it says, okay, you can only have 3 arguments are in this thing. One is the element, one is the array, and one is the index.
Correct.
And I don't know why the element returns you, like, it gives you the function of the key instead of actually giving you access to.
Ah.
If it's built in that,
Okay, so
has to be
yeah,
the
but
element.
even with for each though, or not for each, even with like more modern for loops, such as for of, which we've talked about for arrays, for of where you don't even have a callback function, where it's like, you know, it's just it's just a loop. You say like for let x of numbers, right? And x is supposed to be each number. Even that is not going to give you access to be able to modify what's in.
When you say let element, I'm already saying, oh, well, we're making a new variable that's taking the place of the thing. Once you say let, I just assume, well, it's not gonna. There's no way it's gonna be. There's not gonna be a reference to it.
Got it. Got it.
So I'm using for
So I
each
think the
loop.
gap there is what I didn't cover, which is maybe I should in the next time I do this lecture, which is what happens when you pass primitive values to a function, and then what happens when you pass arrays into functions. So if I pass in a
Does it copy it or does it make it? Is it reference?
exactly. So I think if I'd answer that question for you, then it will explain what the callback function gets, because it's really a function. So the scope is changing there, and something's being passed in. Well, I'll give you the brief answer, which is no. Actually, I'll let you experiment with that. So use the approach that I've gotten here.
I spent 2 hours on day 1 trying to figure out how I couldn't going through every different kind of for loop and seeing if I could get a reference, and they wanted nothing, and nothing was referenced.
And by the way, the answer is the same in Python.
I think you can loop through a dictionary and you can go key index, and if you can change the keys in the indexes by reference. If you loop through a dictionary.
Okay, so you're talking about objects, but I'm talking about arrays specifically. Like in arrays, because your question was in the context of arrays. Your question.
In C++, because in C++ that's what we do all the time. In Java, you for each loop through an array, and you just change everything in the array as you go down. References. Element in it.
I mean, I could answer your question, but I actually don't want to, because I want you to kind of experiment and play with how do I actually accomplish this with an array, and how do I accomplish in JavaScript? Might as well.
Is it worth it? Is it worth trying to find a way to reference it through iteration?
Even with a for each, okay, I'll give you the end result, and then you have to figure out how. You can loop through using for each in an array, okay?
Yeah.
And you know how you said it takes 3 arguments or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You can modify that array as you go. Which is your concern, right? Which is like, I need to be able to modify that array as I go, because
well, I mean, I can do array like bracket index.
Exactly.
And element's just the value at that point.
Exactly.
But I want to not do that. I feel like that's so verbose compared to like, things that I think it should be. But it's only because like when you're like, oh, well, is this a reference or is this just assign the value for the array? I was like, well, nothing assigns reference in JavaScript in my experience so far, so that's probably going to just make a shallow copy of it.
Right.
But you're right, because they definitely pass in through reference in functions, which we've been using functions yesterday all day. We were passing arrays, nothing out. No, we didn't. Oh.
I'm not. You lost me there. I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Maybe we did. I don't know. We haven't been returning a lot. I feel like we've just been.
That's not true. With low tide, you've been returning. Every single function has been returning.
We're returning. You're right. We haven't been using
And
the
you've
side
been-
effect of array returning a new array every time.
Yeah,
And it's like, oh, well, make sure your old array didn't get changed.
exactly, right? We specifically make you think about it, but we don't go all the way in terms of talking about it like this.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah. That's pretty easy check. It's just frustrating. No, well, only because when you assign an array to array, and now it's like, oh, it's pointing to the same array. But so I guess the elements.
But if it was creating a new array every time, then you'd have less power, because at least if it's not, you can deliberately say dot like array.from or array.slice, and you have that option. If it was actually creating a new one every time, then that's less performant. You probably don't. Usually, you actually don't want that. Usually.
You're right. You definitely want.
Yeah. And so and also because it's more costly, let's get you to actually make a deliberate attempt to copy this thing, because that's more costly.
So
both in terms of memory and computation.
The memory. If my value has my array is stored in as a pointer to where my array values are stored, and they're stored because it's stored like a linked list, right? Not stored like an array. Stored like they're not stored sequentially. They're stored like.
Yeah, I think the implementation behind the scenes is a linked list. Yeah, I'm not sure though. I think it is for JavaScript. JavaScript array linked. That would be like I don't even know if I did that. That wouldn't even answer my question. I'd have to go kind of read into the internals.
That would actually make sense now thinking about it, because if I'm the only thing I have that point to each value is what value before it. It's sort of like a linked list, so I wouldn't be able to access that reference value because it's stored in the one before it. It's not stored. You can't just dynamically go through a linked list.
You've lost me a little bit in terms of why that matters.
Well, I'm saying why there's no reference point. Why it can't just give me a reference point when I in a for each loop. It's like, oh, here's the element. Give me the reference to it. If it's not, because it's not stored in. Not like, oh, here's the math from an array, which is stored sequentially. It can just give me like, here's a bunch of memory values that the value is going to be at.
I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that it's a linked list or not.
Really?
It just has to do with the fact that even when I look at just the first line of code here, this, right? We know that this variable, which was in Python tutor, JavaScript tutor on the left there, points to the array, but I can't get the number out of there. Like, what is that memory address? I can't actually get that.
Yeah, you can't access pointers.
No.
In JavaScript.
In a language where you can, like C or C++, you're right. Like, you can use that ampersand or whatever, right, to dereference a value. You can't do that here. So that's the reason that it can't give you the reference to the actual index. But I didn't know how much of that you were going to understand or not. But I guess you do. Okay, cool. So we'll leave it there then.
Okay, that sounds great.
Okay,
wonderful.
Sounds like you've got a little bit of background in programming. Did you do a computer science degree or something?
Computer science.
Okay, so that will.
Mostly just.
Yeah, at least when I did my computer science degree, we didn't even do web development, but maybe that's changed now.
Yeah, I didn't know.
Oh, really? Even still?
Well,
Which school was this?
It wasn't a computer science degree.
Oh, it was computer eng, right? Comp eng, yeah. More hardware stuff too, right?
It was like they forced us to do it was like half and half. They didn't have a hardware software differentiation.
You must have done like assembly and stuff too?
Yeah.
And like
compiler, do all that.
Yeah. Well, that's computer science still. Building a compiler is still computer science. It's more, I think computer engineering is more like also just how it actually works, the hardware stuff, right? Like the gates, like logical, like
making registers, making the clock work in the right.
Yeah, like FPAs and stuff, right? Yeah. Cool. I didn't do that much of that because for computer science, they only did like one course on that.
It's not, I mean, like when you want it, it's like, oh, I want to do software. Like, it really doesn't.
Sure.
The computer handles most of that. They teach you it's like when they, oh, we're learning this. Like,
it's knowledge for the sake of knowledge many times, though, which is not bad. It's just not applicable to your career. Well, it's still applicable to your career, but indirectly, right?
Yeah.
It gives you confidence and better understanding of what's happening, even though you don't really need to know it, right? Like many students here actually don't know about gates and stuff, and they'll be really good developers. They'll be working on this level. They don't need to know what's happening, like just like we don't really know what's happening at the physics level, right? I got to resume actually.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, it's 15 after, so we should resume. So everybody's back here. Hopefully everybody's back in Victoria. And we left off kind of talking about arrays. We learned that arrays, when you create a variable, it creates a reference to an array. And then when you copy that variable, you're copying the reference, to sum it up, right? We'll talk about objects next. And the problem, as I said, I'd like to talk about the problem before we get into the solution. The problem is, most data in software, most information in software is generally logically grouped in some way, right? Like numbers are a part of some other bigger meaning, or strings are a part of some other bigger meaning. For example, you might want to like represent some, I don't know, contacts, like if you're building a contact database. Or if you're a school and you have your instructors, you're building, I don't know, a list of your instructors and their contact information or their skill set or something like that. Well, that's information that's grouped together. It's not one number, right? It's a whole bunch of different data about a particular instructor. Now, the truth is you actually don't need, you can still use arrays for this, right? Like, for example, if I want to store both my name and group them together, my name and my years of experience, I mean, I could not even use arrays. I could just do something like this. Years of experience. Just being lazy there, right? I can just create variables that kind of represent all the data that I need for myself. But this gets quite limiting, right? It's not actually together. It's in separate variables. And when I have hundreds of instructors or a database where it's countless, and I should just be able to keep adding to them, how would I do that? I don't want to just modify the code every time, right? And so we really need a collection of instructors. So the first thing is, I could use arrays for that. Because arrays are collections, they're lists. So I could say something like, something like this, to now have an array of information. But as soon as I do this, I'm now, so in that list, I'm going to have, at position 0, I'm going to have an instructor. Position 1, I'm going to have an instructor, and so on and so forth. So how do I put an instructor at position 0 here? Or position 1? I've got many pieces of information about them, right? How would I go about doing that? Because I only want one of these boxes in this array to take up, to point to an instructor, and all the information about that instructor. Let's say 5 different pieces of information: name, years of experience, location, right? So on. Yep. An array of arrays is a nice logical next step, because an array helps me group that information, right? So I could actually say, no, I'm not going to do it this way. I'm actually going to say KV as an instructor is actually also a whole bunch of information, so I'm going to use an array. And arrays, we know how to define them in terms of square brackets and comma separated values. So I'm going to use that same thing. And as the developer, I just know that the first thing is the name, the second thing is the years of experience, and the third thing is the location, right? And then I would go ahead and add KV. I think that's his last name, right? Just an array of maybe 2 for now, just to prove a point. I've now got information logically grouped together, and it's a collection of instructors, and I've put that in an array as well. Nice. Terrence said the same thing. Let's console log that, right? Because we don't want to just be writing code that we're not able to see what the hell's happening. right? Awkward pause. Any questions? Any thoughts? Does it make sense? So if I wanted to access these instructors one at a time, I would loop through this array, let's say, right? Or let's say I didn't have these variables, and I wanted to go through, I don't know how many. I don't know how many are in there. I just want to go through them all, because I want to list them out in a nice table or something like that. I would loop through this array. And we're familiar with loops. I could use something like for of to loop through an array. And then each value in that array is another array. And so I would do what in order to access their information? I would be using the index, because if I just loop, different positions have different context, right? The first position is the name. The second position is the years of experience. So I'd probably actually say 0, 1, and 2 in terms of being able to fetch that information. Right? So I'm just going to write a little bit of code here. It'll be something like this, right? And then I would do, let's say, you know, something like that. Maybe put years after that, but you get the idea, right? How I'm.
Go through that a little slower.
Yeah, so you want me to go through this? Yeah, sure. So what I did here is I'm looping through the instructors array, right? That's my outer array right here. And I assign each element in that array as I go through it to this other variable each time in that loop called instructor. But instructor is whatever's inside this outer array. Well, we know that the outer array contains other arrays, which contain the data that we actually need about each instructor. And so when I'm accessing instructor, I know that it is actually an array. As a developer, I know that because I'm kind of, you know, I know this whole, what's happening in this file. And so I know to consciously use it like an array, right? If I had just console log instructor, then I would just see that I'm looping through. Let me just get rid of this console log up here. I'm just looping through and outputting 2 arrays, one at a time. So instead of doing that, I wanted to kind of demonstrate what it meant to actually extract the values and log them manually instead of just the array itself. Right? To actually create a nice string out of it or something.
I haven't used that type of for loop. Can you just go over like const instructor, of instructor?
Oh, yes. Sorry about that. So this for loop here is kind of a newer style of for loop, for of, which is similar to like a for each, right? But it's a little bit simpler and it's a little bit more elegant to read and write because it doesn't require like for each with another function inside of it, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on this week. So it's generally like considered the newer way of writing for loops in JavaScript, and one that you'll find a lot of code out there. So what it's doing is essentially, you can say let here as well, but essentially it's saying create a variable called instructor every time in this loop. It's available only in the scope of this loop. So it's instructor singular is only available in this loop. It's not available out here. If I try to console log that, it will say it's not defined. And inside of it, it represents each of those elements as it goes through. So the first time it'll be this one. The second time it'll be this one. It'll be 2 iterations on this loop. You'll find yourself starting to use this loop quite a bit, I guess, as of today. We also have a for in loop, but most of the time you're going to use for of. For in is, so instead of using of here, you'll say for in, and it will allow you to loop through objects or object keys. But we're not there yet, so I didn't want to talk about it yet. So let's talk about the problem here. I said I was going to talk about a problem. We've just used arrays. What's the problem? Is there a problem here? What could be better? I mean, the code seems to run. I'm able to group instructors using arrays. But I'd like to argue that we could do better. But what is not so good that could be better? Yes? The amount of variables used? Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, and I'm kind of asking you to use your imagination here that, we've only put 2 here, but there could be countless that are being put in dynamically, not all up front like this, but as the user, we're able to add more instructors or something using command line or something like that. And this list could just keep growing. So, I mean, this list doesn't have too many variables because it's just instructors is the variable, and then it contains arrays, right? It just so happens that these were created using variables here. But I could have just literally taken this line here and put it in here, right? And so on. So I didn't need these 2 variables here, but I just did that for simplicity's sake. What else is a problem? Yep.
It's a pain finding certain information. Say you want to find the year of Quran, like you, but it's like tens or thousands of indexes into the array. You'd have to look through the whole array to find where you are to access the age.
So that's the one problem for sure, is that in order to get to KV, I need to know where KV is in the array. So if I happen to know that KV is at position 500, then great, I can access that because an array allows me to say, that would be 500, right? Array at 500. But I might have to search for KV by name or something, and that requires looping through, and that would be 500 iterations before I found KV. So that's one problem for sure. I agree. There's another problem as well. There's 2 problems, I guess. Yep. The naming convention. Can you elaborate, maybe? Say that again. I can't, sorry. Like line 17? What about it? It could be what? More simple? How? Like another name? Yeah. I think you're onto something. Yep. Yeah, you're much closer. So you're essentially saying that the data is not really labeled very well, I think is what you're saying. And so it's hard to know, we have to kind of remember, when I look at this line of code here, or when I was writing this line of code, rather, I had to know that position 1, the second position, was years of experience. And if I wanted to add additional information, I better be careful because I don't want to add stuff in the middle because that'll push stuff out, right? And all the indexes will now point to something else, right? And so it's just confusing to see numbers here, like 0, 1, 2. Why can't we just say instructor dot name, instructor dot years of experience, it would read much nicer. So I think that's what you were saying, and if not, that is what I'm saying. Terrence was talking about a different problem, which is duplication. Yeah, I was ignoring that problem, Terrence. So good catch, but not one that I'm dealing with right now. It was more so to do with how I'm reading this code, and I'm finding it if there was hundreds of fields, not only just the 3 that we have here, name, years of experience, and location, but if there's a whole bunch of data, I would just have a whole bunch of numbers to reference that data for a given instructor, and that's just hard to read and annoying. Right? It's a readability and maintainability nightmare. It's possible. You can do it, but it's just annoying. Okay, so one of the things that we can use to actually clean this up a little bit is to use objects in JavaScript. How are we going to do that? Well, instead of using arrays, so maybe I'll create a different file, actually. I'll create a file for something like that. And then I'll rename the existing 4 that I have, final example, to 5. Right, so in here, I'm going to say, actually, KV is going to be an object using curly brackets instead of square brackets. And in there, I'm actually going to specify, again, grouped information. It's going to be 3 different values. But instead of using 0, 1, and 2, I'm actually going to use strings to label that data. That gets me closer to understanding objects. Okay, that's a big value proposition that I get with objects. And for sake of readability, maybe I'll even make it look like this. So now, when I want to access, let's just do one more. Right? When I want to access these objects now, when they were arrays, we did this. But now, I'll actually use, I could use square bracket notation, and I can just say name like that. And so when I'm reading that, I understand what I'm trying to access. Right? 0 doesn't tell me much. I have to kind of look back at the array to really understand what the hell is at 0. But here, the order doesn't matter. It's just whatever the key is for that value. So the key is name, and the value is Kuram Virani. Right? And I access data by key. And if I already know the key, like if it's literally in the code, like name, I can even do dot like that. Right? And both of those will be the same thing. So if I run this, I'll see that I'm able to access the name the same way, right? On myself, let's say, and on the other object. Same idea. Question? Yeah?
So should you use like the dot name instead of like bracket whenever possible?
Yes, whenever possible, use the dot. So are we comfortable with like, instead of an array, it's still kind of an array, except instead of numbers, we're using strings to identify the locations? Like if I ran this in Python Tutor, it would still do the similar thing as an array. Okay, let's actually do that really quickly. Maybe there'll be another line that does, let's just copy the whole thing. See, it's still got 3 elements in there, except instead of 0, 1, 2, it's just these are the keys. It actually looks, what does this look like? It's a table. I like to think about objects as tables. It's 2-column tables, always. The first column is the keys. The second column is the values. And the same we will see with the other one, right? And we're able to access those values, just like with arrays, We can use, in arrays, the key is a number, like 0, 1, 2, and it's always incrementing by 1. In objects, it's whatever you decide it to be. Yep. Why would you ever use an array? Well, if I want to have a collection of these, and I want to just store them as like as a list, and not have to actually associate that each item in that list with a key, then an array makes sense. So array makes sense for like ordered list. Object makes sense for when you don't care about the order and you want to directly access something. So an example of an array would be like, I want to know, for example, messages in a chat app. Okay? The order matters. So that would be an array of messages in your Messenger app, right? And each message could be an object, because it would be the text, the timestamp for when it was sent, maybe even the cell tower it was sent from, or other information, right? So that would be an object, but it would be within an array of objects. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll even write it down. And by the way, I'll be sending notes out that are a lot more verbose than what you see here. So this is good for storing key value pair data when we want to quickly access a value via a key. Right? Like example is person.name. I want the name. I don't want to have to loop through the person to get the 10th value, which is their name. Right? Because I don't know where it's stored. I don't want to say at 7 because that doesn't tell me that that's the name. That just says index 7. That's not very ideal. So this is great for, I want to just be able to quickly access that value. I know the key. Okay. Arrays are good for storing linear information where order matters. You can have an array of objects, right? So you could say an array of messages. Whereas an object, the order shouldn't matter. How we use objects, order shouldn't matter. It depends on the language. So the question is, if you loop through an object, are you guaranteed the same order that you used? And in JavaScript, actually the answer is yes. So it actually behaves like an array, where the order is preserved. But in many languages like Ruby, I think they changed it, but the order didn't matter. So you could put it in this order, and when you loop through it, it's a completely different order, right? Because that's not what you're generally using it for. There are many synonyms for what objects are called. The way we use objects here, there's another word for it that's very common. So if I actually look up JavaScript objects, it may even come up as a word. Let's see if it does. I think MDN might use it. Let's see if they do. Yep. Yes, right here. Because they're so similar to arrays, except you're associating them with keys, they're often called associative arrays. So it still behaves like an array. You can still loop through it. And in many cases, order matters. Like here, it's preserved. And so all it is an array, but it's associated with key values. Another word is, I would even argue you could call them tables, like 2-column tables. Not very common though in the industry, so I'll just say KV's term. Another term is what is it? Oh, dictionary, because you like look up by a thing and then you have the definition of it. So dictionary. And then there's a few others, but you get the idea. In case you come across those terms, we're essentially using those. Oh, another one is map. Now, it's a bit confusing because JavaScript introduced the idea of a map. So now we have maps and objects. So that's like, because objects can do way more than just maps. So now you could use maps to just do the thing that we're doing right here, right? To build an instructor profile, for example. But to be honest, everybody in the community is still just using objects for that. So map's just not being used a lot. And in really what we're using it as a map. It's mapping this key to this value, this key to this value, this key to that value. So not like map as in navigation, but map as in mapping keys to values, right? Any questions so far before we take on a little bit of a challenge? Yeah, so unfortunately, another term is hashes, which is really misnamed. Ruby calls them hashes. What we're doing here with objects is called hashes in Ruby. And the problem is it's a conflated term. The reason they're called hashes is because actually they're hash tables. And again, it's the table part that's important. But unfortunately, they took the first part, which is really just how it's implemented. It's an internal implementation detail. It's like calling an array a linked list. That's just how it's implemented. And now I'm getting too advanced, and I'm going to say we can talk about that later. But yes, the answer is yes. In Ruby, these are called hashes. Yes?
Just a question about accessing the values in an object. I know you can use the dot, but when would you use the square bracket?
Yes, that's a really, really good question. The question is from Anne. The question is from Anne. Why? Like, there's two different notations. One is with square brackets and a string inside of it, like I showed here. Whoops, sorry. Like I showed here. And then the other is the dot notation. Both work exactly the same. So why would you use one over the other? Well, yeah, absolutely.
I've tried to use functions with using dot notation before, and it's looked very confusing and sometimes not even work.
So a function on an object, and then you're not able to, you don't find it as ideal?
I tried to do like dot notation and then dot the function, and it was kind of hard to follow. And also, yeah, I had an error for it.
Okay. So instead of repeating your answer, I'm actually going to go a little bit further into answering your question. You're on to something. But what I'll say is this, actually. I'll kind of challenge what you just said, and I'll repeat it in that process. We know that when I use the dot notation, I'm saying like object dot property. Okay, this is called a property. I forgot to mention that. So these are all properties. And each property has a key and a value. Makes sense, right? An instructor has many properties. So I'm doing object dot property. Anytime I see this, I know I'm working with an object. On the left side is an object. So for example, if I do something like this, I am working on an object because I'm using dot notation. Strings are actually primitives, aren't they? So that's confusing. It's another confusing part of JavaScript. In JavaScript, strings are both primitives and objects. When you first define them, they're primitives. And you're able to use, they're actually the value in the array. But as soon as you call a dot thing on it, like a dot length, it actually, behind the scenes, converts it into an object so that it can actually support dot length because you're actually calling a function on it. So this is a property, right? So, all to say, the dot notation means that I'm dealing with an object. The square notation also means I'm dealing with an object, so that's true as well, because an array is an object as well. So whenever I'm doing square brackets 0 or square brackets name, I'm still dealing with an object, right? In fact, what's even more confusing in JavaScript is if I do type of, that's a number. That's a string. That's an object. It's also an object. It's confusing. I would expect array here, right? But it also kind of verifies that arrays are also objects in JavaScript. Anyway, I'm going to answer your question shortly. I'm kind of working towards it. There's a little bit of a difference, though, right, in terms of how we're calling this here. In one case, we actually provide the string, and in the other case, we say dot name, right? But sometimes we actually don't have the property name in the code. The property name itself could be dynamic. So maybe I'd have a variable called key, and it is set to name. Okay, that's the key that I want to actually use to look up the value, the name value from this object. Well, this is a string, right? So I can just replace this string with this keyword key here. And that should work. Because it will say, OK, what is key? Key is name. And in its head, JavaScript will replace it with name here. Right? And so if I run this, it will still work. But I can't do that with the dot notation. Because if I say dot key, what I'm actually doing is saying there's a property with the key. So you better know the thing you're looking for when you're doing dot notation. You can use square brackets because it takes in a string. You can pass in dynamically another variable there, which could be a string.
So if one of the keys within your object is 2 words, you put it in a string, and like, is that when you'd also use that square bracket notation to reference it?
Yes. Another reason would be to use another reason to use square brackets is when you have spaces in your strings. So what's being asked there, just to repeat the question, is what if it was like name of person? Well, that's not going to work. That's invalid syntax, first of all. So I need to turn it into a string here. And then when I'm actually accessing it, I cannot use dot notation. I have to use square bracket notation. So that'd be another reason. But to be honest, you want to avoid that when possible, right? You want to do something like name of person and use the same way you would name a variable, which is without the spaces, as much as possible. Not always the case, but. Now, where it gets really interesting is you can also assign functions to objects. So I can say greet is a function. And so these values in this table don't have to be primitive data types. They don't have to be or other arrays and objects. They can even be behavior. So here we have information which can store behavior, which is interesting. Right? And the behavior in this case could just be a simple console log hello from Travis, right? And we could do the same thing up here with hello from KV, right? And now we can say console log, or not even console log, just kv.greet, right? But that's not how you call a function, is it? How do you call a function? Parentheses, exactly. So I'm going to use parentheses to invoke that function on that object. Let's see if that works. And then I'll summarize that a little bit, and then we'll move on to the challenge. So you can see as I run that, hello from KV right there, right? Oh, and by the way, that console log.kv.key, I forgot to show you that doesn't work, right? That gives me undefined because there is no key called key here. But yeah, kv.greet works great. tb.greet will also work great. Right? So you can actually have behavior associated on a particular object, which is really cool. What does this remind you of? We've already done stuff like this. This reminds me of console.log, right above. Object.key, or property. And it happens to be a function, so I'm going to use parentheses to invoke it. And in the case of console log, it actually takes in what I want to log. It takes in arguments. So does that mean that console is an object? Interesting. If I just type in console, here it is with the curly brackets. It's an object of type console with a whole bunch of different properties, all of which happen to be, most of which happen to be functions. Is that true? Damn, it is true, right? What about process? Because we did process.argv, didn't we, earlier? So what process? Whew, that's huge. Also an object with properties like title. Didn't even know that one existed, but sure. Version, that sounds important, right? And even has properties that point to other objects. Just like arrays can have arrays, objects can have arrays or other objects. Wow. Cool. Again, I'm showing you kind of how to experiment and play around and actually answer some of these questions yourself, right? Like, oh, interesting, is that true? Let me open up Node and just check it out. OK, any questions about that before we move on? Yep.
Can objects like have functions or methods within them that aren't associated with the key, but just like perform a behavior in the object?
Yep. Yeah, I didn't want to get there yet because I'm limited on time. But the question is, can objects actually have functions that don't necessarily, in this case, actually, it doesn't operate on the object itself, but you could actually make it like access name or access, years of experience. Console log, for example, like it doesn't change anything about the console. It just prints something out to the screen, right? So it's just a collection. It's just a great way to collect a whole bunch of functions that all kind of do similar things. So they're like, let's put them in an object called console, right? It's like a way of collecting useful information. Just like, my information, it all kind of belongs to me, to an instructor. So let's logically put that in an object. Same idea with functions. You can group them together. Great question, by the way. Any other questions? No? So Terrence is asking, can we call it with a number rather than the exact string? So, since it was the first property name, can I use kv at 0 to access kv? What do you guys think? Since it's an associative array and also kind of like an array, can't I access it by index as well? Let's do it at the very bottom. What will this do? Give you the key? Let's try it. She's not sure what it will do. Whoops. Is that the file I'm on? Yeah. So you have to use the strings to be able to access those properties, the key string. Right? There is no property with 0. But what happens if I did? I mean, you could start asking a lot of what-if questions. What if I did this? Right? Will that? And I just won't go down that rabbit hole right now because there's a lot of these kind of like weird quirks that we could look into that language specific. Then you're starting to learn a little bit more about the language and not necessarily what to use these constructs for, right? What are they meant for? But let's take a look at that final example or challenge that I wanted to. So the challenge I wanted to take on, I forgot to erase this, is like we take a sentence, given an English sentence of words, determine the word density. Find out which words are in the given sentence and how many times each word appears. Essentially, that's what it means by density, right? So what I did last time when I did this lecture, I left it in there by accident, was I just looked at like funny sentences because I didn't want to come up with one. And I looked at one of my favorite authors, Douglas Adams, and quotes from him. Anybody know Douglas Adams? Author of like, yeah? Exactly, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and so on. And he has some really funny quotes in that book. It's a hilarious book, as well as some other stuff that he's written. One of the funniest ones that I like is, I think it's like the beginning of the book. Oh no, this one's a good. I'm just going to go into it. It's good. Good digression. I love this one. I love deadlines. I like the whooshing sound they make as they fly by. That one's a good one. Oh, I like this one as well. The universe. In the beginning, the universe was created. This made a lot of people very angry and has been widely regarded as a bad move. Let's take that one. And for simplicity's sake, we will remove the dots that are periods associated with words because that will count as a different word. So we'll just keep it simple and say, let's pretend they don't have punctuation. So how would I go about solving this problem? And remember, the goal of the lecture isn't solving the problem. We're only at 5 minutes left at the end of the lecture, so we may not get to fully solving it, but it's about the approach, right? And we could even start off by saying, well, how would I solve this using the constructs that I know? I know about primitive types. I know about loops. I know about if statements. I know about arrays. I know about objects. Can I use these things to solve this problem, right? So really what I want to end up with is like a word density count. So it would be something like in. And it would say something like in occurs once. The occurs 2 times. Occurs, seems like 2 times, and so on. Right? Sorry. And so on. And this would be for every single word in the sentence. If I look at that, though, what does that look like? It looks like an object. It looks like a table, a 2-column table. So it seems to me that the best strategy is to maybe collect these words in an object, which would look a lot like the object that we saw here, where this would be each word in that sentence, or whatever sentence we're dealing with. And what would this value be? Exactly, the density or the number of time it appears. So perhaps that's our solution, right? Is to use objects, not for maybe collecting information about people or businesses or whatever that what our software is about, but really to actually count things and count them kind of uniquely. Because we can quickly look up a value in an object or an associative array by just that value. So once we come across the word the, we can say, oh, did we already come across the? Yes, we did. The value was 1. Well, let's make that 2 now, right? So if I was to write the pseudocode out for this, what would it be? Pseudocode. So start with an empty object. We'll call that results, because that's our table. It's empty at first. We then loop. We have to loop through the words. We're going to have to figure out how to do that, right? But let's assume we figured that out in terms of the syntax. That's just a syntax problem, right? I just have to Google JavaScript, loop through sentence, or loop through words in sentence or something like that to be able to come up with a strategy there if I don't know how. So I'm focusing on the high-level problem, not so much how to do it in JavaScript. And then Yeah, so loop through words. And so what we'll do is in pseudocode, we'll just write that each word maps to the variable word. And so we'll say if word is in results, what do we do? Yeah, increment results value, results word value by 1, right? So it would be something like, the JavaScript for that would be something like results at word equals results at word plus 1. Because results at word is going to give us the value for that word, which we know the value is going to be like a number if it's there. We're not putting anything else in there. So we increment that number by 1. Else, the word is not in results, because we started with an empty table, right? So we may not have it in there if it's the first time you come across that word. So then what we would do is exactly add it to results with value 1, because we've seen it once now. Not 0, because we haven't seen it 0 times. We've seen it once now. I think that's it, right? And then we just return results. So it's not anything too complicated, right? And we're able to actually use objects now to kind of store unique values and actually use it as a way of having like a table that helps us count unique values, which is another interesting application of objects. One that's different than what I was showing earlier. We're at 12 o'clock. I can leave it to you to write the code for this. The last time I did this lecture, I had another 10 minutes, so I actually ended up writing the code. Again, not super important. It's more about problem solving and approach and using these constructs. So they will be in my notes. Any questions outside of all of this or as part of all of this? Yeah.
I again missed it. Did you say that objects are not ordered?
They are ordered in JavaScript, but in many other languages, they're not. I believe they are ordered in JavaScript. Right? Aaron? In JavaScript, objects do have order to their keys if you loop through the keys, right? So if you do, from memory, I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. And I'm intentionally showing you that we're not sure because we don't remember these things, even if at some point we remembered. Like at some point, Aaron probably was asked this question earlier on in boot camp, or he was asked this question as part of trying to solve a problem. And he knew, and then he just forgot because he can always look that up. Right? And that's the most important thing I want you to realize is, and that's why I always deliberately tell you what I'm unsure of, because I want you to prioritize what's important to actually learn versus just learn in the moment for solving the problem and then forget. And that's okay too. Right? Things like syntax or things like intricate details about how that works, because it does vary from language to language. Syntax varies from language to language. How objects are handled varies from language to language.
I think the gotcha with that one is because JavaScript follows specification, not an implementation. There's a few different engines out there, and they're almost all identical. But I think getting caught up with that would be silly because it may just be changed around in certain circumstances.
I'm not sure if your answer is true. I think its specification does says that they have to be ordered, but I could be wrong.
If it's in there, then it will be not
Yeah.
the same. Some things like that.
Yeah.
Universal.
So for Victoria's sake, I just basically asked one of our mentors here, Aaron, just what his opinion was, just to prove that, like, you know, a lot of these things we're not exactly sure of, and we find out in the moment as well, and that's an important takeaway. Any other questions? No? So I'll send out notes, which will kind of be a recap of everything we did, including the code that we wrote. Hopefully this was useful and valuable, and I'll let you guys work with objects today. But just remember, you will not have mastered objects by the end of today. You will still feel very uncomfortable with them. And if you are feeling like you only got 80% of today done, as you progress through a week, you are more likely to start falling behind. So don't start panicking. I know it's your first week. If you're like, you know, you had a few assignments left from yesterday, and now you're working on today's, you're completing that stuff. By the time you start today's stuff, it's already halfway through the day, and now you only got through half of today's stuff. You'll have to continue linearity, at least on the core work, and it's okay to be a certain amount of days, a certain amount of fractions of days behind, right? It is not disastrous, because Fridays are generally good catch-up days, and weekends are a great time to catch up as well. Okay? Cheers. Oh, okay. Thank you. This one's an applauding cohort. That's different.